today on CityCast Pittsburgh. Last year, Japanese company Nippon Steel announced plans to acquire an iconic Pittsburgh company, U.S. Steel, for a staggering amount of money, nearly $15 billion. But since then, there has been a lot of criticism, from the local steelworkers union all the way up to the White House. So what's behind all this pushback? And what's next for U.S. Steel? It's Monday, March 25th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. Chris Bream is a regional economist with the Urban and Regional Analysis Program at the University of Pittsburgh's University Center for Social and Urban Research. And maybe more importantly, he's a friend of the pod. Chris, welcome back to CityCast Pittsburgh.
It's good to be here. Good to be here.
So many news outlets have been talking about this potential sale of U.S. Steel, headquartered, of course, here in Pittsburgh, to this company, Nippon. What would it mean to Pittsburgh, to union jobs, to the whole U.S. of A. if Pittsburgh lost its steel company? What do you think?
Well, what does lost mean? Let's start with that, right? This is a corporate entity, happens to be a Japanese corporate entity attempting to buy this company now known as U.S. Steel. So the lost means a change in ownership. It doesn't necessarily mean that steel is going away. I mean, we don't actually know everyone's plans. We don't know what the other potential buyers would do with U.S. Steel assets. So I think the steel jobs that are here are probably going to stay, at least in the short term. They're not going to spend that money to shut things down. But in the long term, we'll have to see. I think the long-term story is a more complex one.
One of the most interesting things that, you've been writing about in recent weeks, you just take this completely different tack, I think. You go back in time, explaining that U.S. Steel has not always been the champion that Pittsburgh likes to think that it is, that I think broadly is kind of in our public consciousness. Take us back. Where did U.S. Steel actually come from, and where did the company originally try to root itself?
Right. Well, U.S. Steel, the corporate entity, right, is this thing created by J.P. Morgan and its first CEO, Albert Gary, where they bought out, Andrew Carnegie and merged it with lots of other steel competitors, created this corporate behemoth that was U.S. Steel, very much a big corporate entity, very different from Andrew Carnegie, who had been here for decades, had been an entrepreneur in Pittsburgh for decades. And the metals industry in Pittsburgh predates Andrew Carnegie. So, I
didn't realize it went back as far as it did until I was reading some of your writing, that it's really it's the earlier part of the 1800s that this really starts to boom everywhere.
The J&L plant that spanned both sides of the Mon River was operating, by the 1860s with the first integrated ironworks in Pittsburgh. We were a metals industry before that because of the nature of the availability of coal and iron ore in the rivers here.
But U.S. Steel didn't, I guess, initially envision Pittsburgh as its home place. Where did it all kind of get started?
Well, J.P. Morgan, was a finance person. He was a Wall Street person. The headquarters of U.S. Steel, when it was formed, was New York City. And it remained that for several decades. It did come back to Pittsburgh in the 1930s. And sort of the U.S. Steel headquarters was here for many decades. Skipping ahead, many of us remember that U.S. Steel kind of tried to get out of the steel business in the late 80s and 90s.
Yeah. I remember I saw you write that even as early as the 70s, they were openly asking if maybe coming to Pittsburgh had been a mistake. How did the city, its leaders, regular Pittsburghers respond to that kind of news, especially in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s? They're talking about Pittsburgh may not have been the spot.
So I think, steel is such a part of the Pittsburgh ethos, as it were. It's almost it was inconceivable for, a half a century or more that steel would move away. But the corporate entity sort of has shareholders, has its own prerogatives. The 70s that you refer to was a period of time where might seem like it's recent news that environmental concerns are between the community and the corporation are in the news. That was big news in the 70s. It was really in the late 60s into the 70s where people were sort of pushing back on both water and air pollution at U.S. Steel plants. And what you saw was U.S. Steel pushing back on people attempting to impose regulatory costs on them. And that was resulted in full-page ads in the newspapers, resulted in fights that are bigger than even what we see today, if I can just summarize it there.
Yeah. So take us into the 21st century. What has U.S. Steel and its reputation kind of meant to the city, I guess, in the last 25 years?
Look, steel is here. It's sort of like what I say about unemployment. Unemployment isn't 5 or 6 or 7%. It's 0 or 100% based on whether you have a job, right? So it's a very important set of jobs for folks in the industry. And we have these few remaining plants, but it's very few, right? U.S. Steel itself is the Edgar Thomson Works. It's the Clairton Coke Works. It's the plant in
Clairton and Braddock.
Yeah, these are Edgar Thomson is in Braddock, and the headquarters folks, right? That right there says a lot, right? A lot of us still call this big rusted by intention building downtown the U.S. Steel building, right?
Rusted when you get close up, but from a distance, it's the huge black one that rises over everything else.
And the rust is by intention, right? They designed it that way, right? It's called weathering steel. It's meant to protect the steel. I mean, it's probably U.S. Steel's own steel. They made it themselves, but they haven't owned that building for a while.
But it's still called that. And in a lot of Pittsburghers' minds, I think it still feels like U.S. Steel is literally hovering over Pittsburgh in a very tangible way.
It's a very visible presence, right? Of course, what's the name on top of it now? It now says on top UPMC, right? So the Pittsburgh skyline tells the tale more than anything else. But look, it's an industry. It's important for a lot of families, but it's not a very big industry in Pittsburgh. Let's leave it there, right? There are maybe 3,000 at most U.S. Steel employees, all of primary metals, maybe 10,000 jobs in the region. Just to put that in perspective, I believe the peak manufacturing employment in the Pittsburgh region was probably on the order of 380,000 workers, most of which was either steel or related to steel in some way. But
that was ages ago now.
That was probably the peak was probably in the 1950s, sort of during the Korean War, if not during the middle of World War II. And so, that's now 75 years ago. Nonetheless, there were generations of workers, and a lot of the workers who are probably still in those plants have long family histories in those plants, which sort of adds to sort of the emotional angst of it moving on.
Well, and I think a lot of us still have it in recent memory, too. Like, it's rare that I meet a native Pittsburgher that doesn't have someone in the family that worked at one of the steel mills.
I think as you get into the older generation, I mean, if not directly related for steel, everything was related to steel, right? The mill workers and their families were spending money in town. The money was coming from those steel jobs. And it was even more visible. I may be the last of a generation that can remember as a child looking on the mall and seeing an orange glow, right? I mean, that these plants were operating oftentimes 24/7, and they visibly changed the horizon of what was going on. But the economic geography of steel has shifted. I mean, this is not a place to make that is not the most competitive place to make steel going forward, and that's been a hard reality for a lot of folks to accept.
Hey, Pittsburgh. I know a lot of yins have been protesting lately, and if you want to get more involved in social justice but just don't know where to start, check out YWCA of Greater Pittsburgh's Racial Justice Challenge. It's the whole month of April, and you'll have the opportunity to complete one short racial justice activity every weekday, diving deeper into issues of race, power, privilege, and leadership. And there are different kinds of modules, so you'll get to explore ideas about bodily autonomy, financial empowerment, caregiving, gun violence, even access to transportation. Plus, you're invited to join in-person discussion groups every Friday all month long at YWCA Greater Pittsburgh in the South Side. Learn more and sign up at ywcapgh.org. You write about this so much more on your blog on Medium and in an op-ed for Public Source. But I think it's so interesting. Pittsburgh has this idea of what the company is. We call ourselves the Steel City. In a way, it kind of feels like we romanticize it a little bit. But it sounds like maybe U.S. Steel really hasn't given the city the same love back always. When do you think Pittsburgh and its people started forming that attachment to it? And I guess by extension, to U.S. Steel specifically?
U.S. Steel was a symbol for the nation. I mean, when U.S. Steel was formed, it was the first billion-dollar company. Doesn't sound like a big number now. You said $15 billion for the sale price. This is $1 billion in 1901 prices.
Wow.
So it was a monster company that really controlled large parts of the national economy. So I think the fact that it was located here in Pittsburgh, whether its headquarters was here or not, was displaced so many other things. I think that's the economic story of Pittsburgh. Steel was so competitive here. It was such a perfect place to make steel for so long that even if we were good at doing other things, they tended to be displaced by what we call in economic terms comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage was in steel beyond everything else. So nothing else really had much chance to grow.
Which I guess was for a number of factors. It was the relative wealth. It was the riverways. It was our geographic features that had a major coal deposit just around the corner.
I think coal is probably where you start with that story. The river is certainly very important, rail and transportation lines. And early on, iron ore. In fact, we probably exhausted the iron ore supply early on. A lot of the iron ore had to be come in from the other side of the Great Lakes. Soon on, but coal is really the story of Pittsburgh. This tremendous, what we call metallurgic coal or coking coal was ideal for the technology of making carbon steel for most of a century. Connellsville coal, we have a whole seam of coal called the Pittsburgh seam coal we're standing on top of, both of us. That gave us an advantage over almost anywhere else in North America at making steel.
I feel like we're one of the only places in the country where if you say Coke, people don't automatically gravitate towards the brand,
I think we used to teach probably second and third graders how the way we make steel. I think kids have lost that now, but I think it was sort of taught to us at an early age.
So why isn't Pittsburgh a good place for steel anymore?
So fundamentally, what happened is the geographic reasons that made us the center of the steel universe have almost flipped on their edge. The modern way of making steel, which emerged in the 60s, was something called electric arc mini mills. Mm-hmm. And that is a very different cookbook for steel. They didn't use coal at all. Really use electric furnaces. So electricity can come from many sources, but you're not reliant on coal. You're not reliant on our high quality metallurgic coal. You're not relying even on iron ore, which we had great supply chains for here. You're mostly using scrap steel. We are not a competitive place for electricity rates. We're not a competitive place to either acquire scrap steel. And so for that reason, these new steel plants emerged everywhere. They can emerge in almost any part of the country and have. And so for that reason, this is probably the last place in the world you would probably have a big investment in an electric arc mini mill, despite that being the way steel is made. Or where most new steel investment has been made for decades. And we have not seen an electric arc mini mill built here yet, really, at the end of the day.
So let's talk a little bit more about Nippon Steel buying U.S. Steel and all of this criticism that has come with it. Both Pennsylvania senators are against it, John Fetterman and Bob Casey. Biden said this month that he is against it. The United Steel Workers, of course, hate it. And now the deal is under review by this government committee, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., because they say that maintaining American ownership may be vital for national security. Are you surprised by any of this pushback?
I'm a little surprised by the scale of it. I mean, this is not the 1970s. I mean, this is not Japanese steel flooding the market and taking away jobs from U.S. workers, right? This is really about who owns that plant. The steel that will come out of these plants, whether it's owned by a Japanese firm or an American firm, is still American steel.
Because they're not going anywhere. At least that's the promise, that they're going to maintain all the jobs, maintain the pensions, maintain everything. That's what Nippon says.
I think we don't.
But it'll be owned by another nation, technically.
owned by another nation technically, but let's put it this way. This is probably the most important issue for Pittsburgh is these firms, these plants, if they're going to continue operating, will need significant reinvestment. And if not, it's just a matter of time before they shut down. And I can't say for certain Nippon Steel is any less. They may be more able to make that type of investment needed to keep them going. I don't know. But I think each of these firms will have plans and shifts that will come from an acquisition.
And there have been other companies in the mix. The one I think that was most recent was Cleveland-Cliffs. They were a deal on the table as recently as a few months ago, but they were offering, I think it was about half of what Nippon now has on the table.
Clearly, Nippon Steel must have put more, money on the table to make this deal happen so much. Cleveland-Cliffs has a lot of local ties. It's an Ohio-based firm. I think the
Steelworkers Union is very much in favor of them.
And I think that just is pretty straightforward reflection of the fact that I think the same union already represents a lot of those Cleveland-Cliffs workers. And I think they felt a little more comfortable with that. I mean, it's not like there aren't unions in Japan, but clearly a very different set of unions. And I don't think, just so you know, the union's not going to disappear. These will remain unionized plants despite the change in ownership, I would believe.
Are union regulations, I assume they're not the same country to country. Like, if a contract here in the U.S. is, signed and sealed, does that mean that it has to be honored in the same way in another nation?
Look, for certain, union and labor management relations in Japan and Europe can be very different from here in the U.S. But I think the angst, if you peel the onion here a little bit, there's a lot of animosity between the USW and the management of the ownership and management of U.S. Steel right now. And I think that's what's driving a lot of the pushback against the Nippon Steel ownership. Because one of the things that happens is Nippon Steel, being a foreign company, is probably keep some of its U.S. management here in place. And I don't think that's going over well with the workers, the rank and file workers. And
the U.S. government has said that it is under review. They almost never tell you how long those reviews take. The companies, U.S. Steel and Nippon, I think, said that they wanted to have it done by spring or summer. There's no way to tell whether that's actually going to be true. I guess, Chris, as you're kind of zooming out from all of this, if U.S. Steel gets sold either to Nippon or to someone else at some point in the future, do you think Pittsburgh's going to be okay?
The future of steel in Pittsburgh, we're in the end game of a long history. Most of the steel in Pittsburgh exists, honestly, because of the scale of investment in these plants. They operate for a long time. They have long lives. They're not disappearing overnight. But without that investment, this is not the region of the country that you would probably pick as the best place to invest. It's just a matter of time. I don't think there's going to be growth in what we have. It's just a matter of how long they keep Clairton running. And once Clairton stops running, we have to question whether or not some of the other plants that rely on the coke that comes from the Clairton Coke Works will be available. And so once that goes, you might lose the remainder or big bulk of the carbon steel, the commodity steel production in the region.
I guess on the flip side, can you imagine a future for Clairton or Braddock, communities like them, where they get more investment if the plants are someday closed, if we're dealing with land instead of big, massive facilities?
This is the story of Pittsburgh writ large, in that, there has not been other investment in Clairton because of that plant. And until it goes away, you're not going to see a lot of other industries move in there. It displaces the land, it displaces the workforce, it displaces just, whether it's a place you want to co-locate a new industry in. So I think for a lot of this change has happened across the region. You did not see new industries move in until steel kind of stopped being this big, huge elephant in the room.
Should Pittsburgh just let go a little bit? If it's genuinely not easy for us to do this anymore, we're not really a spot for it. All of our infrastructure is aging and someone wants to buy it out. Would it serve us to just kind of let go of the past a little bit?
And Pittsburgh is so good at letting go of the past. So
you make a good point.
Again, the point I make often is that Steel existed in Pittsburgh longer than any one industry will exist in any one region ever again in the future. I mean, this was a tremendously long run, but we are much more near the end of steel in Pittsburgh than any beginning. And there's not any real reason, again, as I just explained, to think of Pittsburgh as a place for a lot of new steel investment. If we get some reinvestment in these plants to keep them going, I wouldn't be surprised by that. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but we're not going back to the past. It's just not going to happen.
Lieutenant Commander Chris Bream, everybody, thank you for your wisdom and your very snazzy Navy uniform today on CityCast Pittsburgh.
Wow, that's good. Anyone who ever says that, I ask them what they did in the Navy, because only people in the Navy know what I am.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you want to read more from Chris, including this incredible tale of a decision that was made around Christmas in 1998 that really changed the course of an entire neighborhood, and he argues to some extent the city, check out our show notes. We will have links to his scholarship about steel and jobs and their messy place in Pittsburgh history. As always, if you're liking what you hear, please leave us a nice review and 5 stars in Apple Podcasts. We will be back tomorrow with more news from around the city. Talk to you in soon.
I mean, so I brought this up several times. What you didn't follow up with was, why isn't this a great place for...
Just call me out. It's fine.
You can use this for your post-credit thing, or whatever you do.
I'm glad you know the system now.